Gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind taking your seats. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. You're all very welcome. We're delighted you're here, and we're actually more delighted that Roger Cohen made it. His flight was cancelled, and he was stuck on the Kennedy, an unpleasant experience, as all of us know. Anyway, we're absolutely thrilled to have Roger Cohen back at the Council. He comes here often, and we're so grateful to him for that. Tonight's meeting is on the record, so you're welcome to use social media. Please do silence your phones, but feel free to tweet or do anything else you'd like online. Roger's new book, The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family, will be available for purchase and signing after the program. There was an essay based on it in the New York Times last weekend that was phenomenal. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Dick Longworth will do a write-up of this program. They're wonderful. If you haven't ever seen them, it's the program in 800 words. He likes to get them up early because he's a journalist, so it'll be online tomorrow before noon. We'll give him a lie-in. A couple of upcoming programs. On the 29th of January, we're going to welcome Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundation. She'll be talking about cities and people towards a more resilient world. For those of you who are interested in the Middle East, on February 4th, we'll have Trita Parsi and Michael Singh here on the US and Iran in the area of ISIS. And on March 17th, the day of the Israeli elections, we will welcome Martin Indyk on Can the Middle East Peace Process Be Revived? And if you like the New York Times, save the date of May 6th because we're welcoming David Brooks on that day. How about that? Of course, it's the new year. You're all very welcome. We'd like to thank you all, members, for your generous support. For those of you who aren't members, I would encourage you to check out our website and please join or ask me or one of my colleagues. We'd be happy to tell you how to do that. It gives you great access, and we're delighted to keep our growing membership for young professionals all the way up to our chairman circle. I'll be back up to moderate the Q&A, but in the meantime, could you please join me in welcoming to the stage Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Aeon and a terrific member of the board of the Chicago Council, Peter Lieb. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome Roger Cohen to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. As you know, in July of this year, an extraordinary amount of violence erupted in Israel and Gaza, lasted 50 days, and thousands of lives were lost during that violence. Since the truce on August 26th, European and American attitudes on the Middle East have diverged substantially. In Europe, Roger Cohen wrote that outrage over Palestinian civilian casualties rose to a quote-unquote fever pitch, which morphed from anti-Zionism into anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, in the United States, support for Israel has remained steadfast, especially among the older generations. So why do Europeans and Americans have such divergent attitudes towards this conflict? It's these and many other questions on which I am interested. I'm sure we all are interested in hearing from Mr. Cohen. So let me briefly introduce Roger Cohen to you. Roger has been a columnist for the New York Times since 1990. He became the acting foreign editor on September 11th, 2001. Prior to joining the New York Times, he was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where he opened the journal's European office in Rome and the office in Rio de Janeiro. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Roger Cohen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse the informality. I arrived about a minute ago. It's been a terrible day. Cancelled flights, change of plane, broken toilets and coffee pots on the plane. But I'll pay any price, bear any burden, face down any foe to get to the Chicago Council. I'm a naturalized American, and to me, Chicago is the ultimate American city, rising from the flat plain on the edge of a great lake to take in the peoples of the world in an endless exercise of glorious reinvention. If only the world could be more like Chicago. It's not. People insist on their differences rather than what binds them. They put bad history before the future. They reenact the past to prove a point long since immaterial. They talk about change, but cleave to the status quo. They tug people's gaze into the mire rather than raise it to the glittering heavens. We've been through a very bad year. Sudden rise of ISIS or Islamic State, the beheadings of American journalists, fever and plague, part of a sovereign state in Europe, Ukraine, annexed by Putin's Russia. First time something like that's happened since the end of World War II. And in the Middle East, our subject tonight, another war in Gaza with its more than 2,200 dead, the dashing, at least outside Tunisia, of the Arab Spring, violent mayhem in Syria and Iraq, and the virulent spread of a murderous Islamist ideology of hatred that will kill to stop free speech and targets Jews whenever and wherever it can, as we saw in Paris just a few days ago. So before I get to the Middle East, just a word on Europe, and particularly the Jews of Europe, where the ugly politics of the Middle East have spilled over. Europe, ladies and gentlemen, has not been more combustible in my lifetime. Large and marginalized Muslim communities who feel a strong sense of exclusion, big Jewish communities with a growing sense of fear, stagnant economies, high youth unemployment, strong and growing rightist parties in Britain, France, Sweden, and elsewhere. This, I think you'll agree, is a dangerous brew, and I hate to think what might happen if there were another major incident. The Jews of Europe are feeling uneasy, so are the Muslims. For the Jews, this is not a new condition. My great-grandfather's brother, Michael Adler, was a distinguished British rabbi who in 1916 compiled the prayer book for Jewish sailors and soldiers at the front during World War I. As chaplain, he toured battlefields administering last rites. And at the end of the war, as I discovered in researching my new book, he asked in his diaries if British Jews had done their duty. He wrote, "Did those British citizens of the House of Israel, to whom equality of rights and equality of opportunity were granted by the state some 60 years ago, did these men and women do their duty in the ordeal of battle?" Our answer is a clear and unmistakable yes. This is in 1918. English Jews have every reason to be satisfied with the degree of their participation, both at home and on the battlefronts, in the struggle for victory. Let the memory of our sacred dead, who number over 2,300, testify to this. Well, you can feel the anxiety in his questioning. Do we fit in? Are we Jews equal citizens? Is sacrificing our lives for king and country and then empire enough? The issue for European Jews was always the same, ladies and gentlemen. It was belonging. Be they French or German or Dutch or Belgian, they worried, even in their emancipation, that the Christian societies that had half accepted them might turn on them. And it was Theodor Herzl witnessing, again in Paris, French anti-Semitism as a foreign correspondent covering the Dreyfus case in Paris in 1896. He was moved then to write The Jewish State, out of the very conviction that full acceptance for Jews would never come. And as the terrible events in Paris have shown, Herzl was prescient. Not even he could have foreseen the Nazis' industrialized mass murder of European Jewry, or how anti-Semitism, in its infinite malleability, would transmute from the racist mythologists of the fascist right in the 1930s to the black-clad ideologues of a murderous perversion of Islam. His, Herzl's, was a reluctant conclusion, but an irrevocable one. The Jews needed a homeland because no other place would ever be home. Scrawny scholars would become vigorous tillers of the soil in the Holy Land. Jews would never again go meekly to their fate. they would find a safe harbor. Well, it's not quite turned out like that. Israel has not settled the Jewish question. But at a time of vile slogans, Jews being called pigs in Germany, I was based in Germany in 1998 to 2001. If anybody had told me at that time that you'd hear those kinds of slogans in the streets of Germany, or the synagogue in Wuppertal being defaced, I would have said, you're out of your mind. With that going on, and killings in the Brussels Jewish Museum, and synagogues defaced, and slaughter in kosher supermarkets, we have been reminded of the importance of a Jewish homeland. But you know, as Peter suggested, quoting an early article of mine, Zionism, I've found, is close to a dirty word in Europe. Anti-Zionism, sometimes hardly distinguishable from anti-Semitism, is fashionable among a certain class of bien-pensant intellectuals. Say you're a Zionist, as I sometimes do, and you may encounter a scarcely suppressed gasp of incredulity. It's very different from me writing from Europe and writing from the United States. Here in the United States, I tend, if anything, to be criticized more for being critical of Israel, critical of the expansion of the settlements, critical of what I view as the failure to get serious about a two-state peace. In Europe, it's another story. I get criticized for being a Zionist, for saying that Jews need a homeland, for saying that that fundamental truth has not changed. It is still a very different optic on each side of the Atlantic, and I would say that, if anything, those differences are growing. Well, I'm a Zionist because what I learned of Jewish history on the ground over more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Hungary, and other countries. It's not that I fail to see the injury and loss Zionism caused to Palestinians in the creation of the modern state of Israel. It's that I see no alternative for the Jews, and a Jew is what I am, and there are 6 million reasons why Jews must mean it when they say, never again. Even before Hitler's annihilation attempt, by the earlier 20th century, in my view, no alternative offered a plausible chance of Jewish survival and belonging. If Zionism was a reluctant choice, it was also one about which Jews would not change their mind. And as Joseph Roth once wrote, if there's one nation that is justified in seeing the national question as essential to its survival, then surely it's the Jews, who are forced to become a nation by the nationalism of others. Zionism was a necessary break with past and pogrom. But the Israel to which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in full election mode, I might add, summoned French Jews during his visit this month to Paris, declaring that the state of Israel is at your home. That Israel stands at some distance from the nation envisaged by its Zionist founders. What is the state Israel finds itself in today? Well, the surface in Israel looks wonderful. The modernity of Israel is something incredible. In fact, I don't think there's anywhere else on earth where you can pass from an economy with a developed standard of living to an economy where per capita income is maybe a couple of $100 a day, as you do when you pass from Israel into the West Bank, or even worse, into Gaza. It's a miracle of modernity. It's prosperous, it's growing, it's vital. Democracy is vibrant. If French Jews have been leaving, it's partly because of an increased sense of fear. It's partly because they look at their kids and they look at a moribund French economy and they think, where are my kids going to have more opportunities? There are 2 factors at work. But beneath that glittering surface, there's a lot of disquiet. More disquiet, I found on a recent visit, than I'd sensed in a long time. And I spoke to Amos Oz, the novelist, at his apartment in Tel Aviv. And he said to me, there's a growing uneasiness, social, political, economic. There's a growing sense that Israel is becoming an isolated ghetto, which is exactly what the founding fathers and mothers hoped to leave behind them forever when they created the State of Israel. So what are the elements of this disquiet? Well, I think long dominion, now nearly 50 years, a half century in the West Bank, is corrosive. That kind of rule over the intricacies of people's lives, that kind of daily humiliation inflicted on another people, it's corrosive. There's a sense that the Gaza war, with its more than 70 Israeli dead and more than 2,200 Palestinian dead, changed nothing. Israel went to war, Hamas is still there, the situation is largely unchanged. There's unease in Israel at the anger in Europe at perceived Israeli intransigence. It seems that hardly a day goes by without some parliament, or in the case of Sweden, the government, voting to recognize a Palestinian state. These declarations are largely symbolic. They change nothing on the ground. But they create a feeling in Israel, well, what if one day El flies to Copenhagen and our baggage doesn't get unloaded in a protest? There's a feeling that Europe is growing more resolute in its irritation at the failure to reach a two-state peace. And of course, there's also Islamic State, the violence and turmoil in the neighborhood right next to Israel. And there's a confusion of voices, even from within the outgoing government. You have a minister of an important portfolio like Naftali Bennett, who basically declares we should annex most of the West Bank. That's the only way forward. We should just annex it. We control all the land, let's annex it. Then you have some like the Israeli president, who's very strong on the issue of Arab rights, but also believes there has to be one state. Have one state, give Palestinians the vote and full rights, but let's make it a state. And some are calling for voluntary withdrawal. But there's no agreement, there's no sense of where Israel is headed or of how this seemingly endless conflict can be resolved. But I think one thing is clear. The Gaza war, the third in 6 years, was not an exception to the status quo as it exists today. This is the status quo. This was part of the status quo. There's a law of human nature. If you oppress another people for long enough, they will eventually rise up. They will. And that is the case of the Palestinians. If nothing changes, there will be another Gaza war, and we won't have to wait very long to see it. In my view, ladies and gentlemen, Israel needs political change. This is a very important election in March. If you care about Israel-Palestine, get involved in this election in any way that you can, preferably in the way that I would like you to. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been leading the country on and off for 9 years now, and I don't think there's any clear direction or boldness to his leadership. There are endless tactical adjustments, there are endless attempts to kick the can down the road, but there's no direction. And that's why this election is critical, because the status quo, as I just described it, is not attractive. It's not good for the Jews, it's certainly not good for the Palestinians. And I saw Herzog, the Labour leader, and I saw Tzipi Livni, the former foreign minister and chief negotiator with the Palestinians, when I was there in December. And look, they're no doves. They're fiercely attached to Israeli security. But when they say they would like to seek a two-state outcome, I actually believe them. I don't think it'll be easy to achieve, but I do believe they are serious about trying to get there. And I think they would take serious steps, such as, for example, freezing settlement expansion in the West Bank, settlement building in the West Bank, while you're negotiating. What kind of signal does that send to the Palestinians, if even as you're discussing the creation of a state on 22% or so of the Holy Land, you are still building? I don't think Herzog and Livni would refrain from taking certain constructive gestures. And this is important. It's a fundamental difference with the current leadership. So I don't know if you now understand the way in which I would like you to get involved with this Israeli election, but maybe you have, and I hope you will. The message currently being sent by the Israeli leadership to the Palestinians is not one on which a peace can be built. On the other hand, on the other side, the Palestinians are in complete disarray. Complete disarray. a formidable disarray. I trudged into Gaza on my last visit to Israel. You come out of a super high-tech Israeli facility at the border, people gazing at you from all angles. I hate to think what kinds of electronic beams going through your body from all angles. And you find yourself in a caged walkway, and you walk for about 15 minutes down this caged walkway, and you emerge into the dust and disarray of Gaza. And there's a makeshift border post, and you do some perfunctory paperwork, and then you get in a car and you drive through the ruins. You drive through the stench of sewage. You drive through these concertinaed buildings to left and right. And you find yourself in a place where not a whole lot is happening. I described in one piece how I saw a road was being laid beside the sea, and there was one guy working there, and he was sifting sand. As far as I could see, the sand was being placed on the road, and then it was a sort of Beckett-like thing to observe. And then when he got tired of it, he would just tip the thing out, and then he would start again. And there's a lot of that kind of thing in Gaza. It's a place you can't really, or only with great difficulty, get into or get out of. Nothing has changed. If nothing has changed, that means that what has happened 3 times in the last 6 years will happen again. That's to say, another war. And what you find in Gaza is that the supposed reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah is completely non-existent. It hasn't happened. Hamas blames Fatah, Fatah blames Hamas, and so there is no government really of any kind in Gaza. The border with Egypt is closed. The border with Israel is as I described it. There are 1.8 million human beings there. More than 100,000 homes are no longer habitable. I talked to the head of the UN mission there, who painted a horrific picture that he didn't need to paint because I could see it with my own eyes. And people there have very little hope. And I went to a school, I talked to some kids. They're all getting ready to fight the next war. And, you know, in the West Bank, the situation is better, obviously, but I don't think Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader, has taken a very constructive route of late. You know, there hasn't been an election for 10 years now. There is no real democratic legitimacy for the current leadership. We don't know what the real balance of forces is. The most constructive, meaningful leader in Palestine, Salam Fayyad, who really did a lot to build statehood in the West Bank, to the point that the World Bank declared the West Bank was ready for statehood. He was chased from the scene, and it has to be said that Israel also behaved in a completely unconstructive way toward Prime Minister Fayyad, did nothing to support him, portrayed him as a unilateralist. And I think seeing a Palestinian who played well to an international audience rather thought that was something unwelcome rather than welcome. So the situation is very grim on the Palestinian side too. I don't think that going to the United Nations or now perhaps the International Criminal Court, these developments may produce a feel-good sentiment. They're not going to change the situation on the ground. I don't think they are. I may be missing something, but I really don't think they are. And I may be missing something when I say I don't think there's any viable outcome but a two-state outcome. I certainly don't see it. How do you have one state whose day of independence and whose day of Nakba or catastrophe falls on the same day? And if you look around the Middle East, the examples of functioning multinational societies are extremely hard, if not impossible, to find. The tendency is in the other direction. So I don't see a Palestinian leadership right now prepared for the tough choices that peace involves any more than I see an Israeli leadership prepared for that. And there's no point, ladies and gentlemen, in beginning negotiations. I doff my hat to Secretary of State Kerry. He went there more than 25 times. Nobody could have been more energetic in trying to engineer something. But as long as the situation I described prevails, there is no point in beginning again to negotiate or mediate, trying to mediate. So what? So what should one do? What to do? I mean, throw up one's hands. I don't think so. I mean, occasionally, like everyone in this room, I suppose I do get that inclination. But, you know, if you look at the Saudis, you look at Egypt, you look at the Gulf states, they all, in reality, have more pressing concerns, more pressing enemies than Israel at the moment. In some cases, it's ISIS or Islamic State. In some cases, it's Iran. In most cases, it's oil at $40 rather than $100. So in theory, it's a propitious moment to try and push those capitals, especially if political change came in Israel, try and get pressure from Cairo, from Riyadh, and elsewhere on the Palestinians to try to find a way to unite. It's not going to be easy, so that you're dealing with a united interlocutor. I know that right now we can't negotiate with Hamas, but the fact is Israel has negotiated with Hamas more than once. It negotiated to end the last war in Gaza. It negotiated to secure the release of Shalit. What is much more important than being adamant and having grand principles is trying to be intensely pragmatic about trying to end a conflict that is good for nobody. And on the Israeli side, especially if there's a change of government, I would say that there needs to be a friendly and perhaps at times stern word in the ear of the Israeli leadership and from American Jewish communities across the country, and also from Europe, to say that, again, let's be intensely pragmatic. Freezing settlement building while negotiations are going on, for example, would be a very good thing. Back off the tough questions like the rather meaningless question, in my view, of, you have to say that we are a Jewish state. Well, Israel is a Jewish state. We all know that. And that's what it is. So if you want to get that declaration, fine. But, leave it to the back end of the negotiations. And also the Jordan Valley. I mean, that's a significant percentage of the already reduced territory of the West Bank. If there could be a commitment to a phased and full withdrawal of Israeli forces, that could, I think, include the Jordan Valley, so long as some of the security measures that the United States has spent a long time preparing are put into place, and as long as it's phased, so that every time it's seen that the Palestinians are conforming with what has been agreed, then you move to the next stage. Nobody's suggesting that this happens overnight. And we all, in Europe, in the United States, I think, ladies and gentlemen, know where this ends up, more or less. President Obama had a plan. We were all going to see it. It was going to be made public. It was presented to both sides, and it never was made public, which I think was probably a mistake. And again, we know more or less what's in the plan, the 1967 lines with agreed territorial swaps, full and phased withdrawal, special security measures in the Jordan Valley, some compromise of the holy places in Jerusalem, and some kind of fudge that allows Jerusalem to be eventually the capital of both states, and some way there will be no right of return. Palestinians are not returning to Haifa, they are not returning to Tel Aviv, they will return to a Palestinian state. There can be compensation, There can be recognition of their loss, and there must be, there should be. But these are the tough realities. Again, let's be pragmatic. Let's say the things that it's taboo to say. Let's try to do it. We can't do it by running away from the hard issues, by erecting grand principles that really are only not so subtle ways to kick the can down the road and make sure that no better reality emerges for the millions of Jewish and Arab people living in the Holy Land. You'll say it's impossible. I have moments when I think that, but I grew up partly in South Africa. Nobody predicted Mandela and de Klerk. I spent my entire childhood hearing about the coming bloodbath. It didn't come. The Berlin Wall. When I lived in Germany, I would drive to Poland. I didn't even know where the Polish border was. 12 million people had been killed there just 10 years before I was born. The Arab Spring itself, and now Cuba, it's of the nature of breakthroughs with real leadership that they are unforeseen and unpredicted. Well, let me conclude by returning briefly to the question of Zionism. And in my book, The Girl from Human Street, I follow the saga of my family from Lithuania to South Africa, some to Israel, to Britain, and myself to the United States, where 10 years ago I became an American citizen. And I now have a son who's just had a child called Max Tran Cohen, who lives in Saigon. So I'm glad I finished my... Ho Chi Minh City. So I'm glad I finished my book in time not to have to include the Asian branch. And wherever the family went, there was a measure of unease about being Jewish, about how to fit into society that I described at the beginning. But let's remember that Zionism was a secular political movement seeking a Jewish homeland. It was not a messianic biblical claim to all the real estate of the Holy Land. The creation of Israel is based in law, at least in my view. It's not based in mysticism or revelation. It was voted into existence by United Nations Resolution 181 of 1947, calling for the establishment of two states, one Jewish, one Arab, in Mandate Palestine. Those two states are still needed, living beside each other in peace and security. I'm a Zionist who believes in the words of Israel's founding charter of 1948, declaring that the nation state would be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, and would ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. What I cannot accept is the perversion of Zionism that has seen the inexorable growth of a messianic Israeli nationalism claiming all the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, that has, for almost a half century now, produced the systematic oppression of another people in the West Bank, that has led to the steady expansion of Israeli settlements on the very West Bank land of any Palestinian state, that isolates moderate Palestinians like Fayyad in the name of divide and rule, that pursues policies that will make it impossible to remain a Jewish and democratic state, that seeks tactical advantage rather than the strategic breakthrough of a two-state peace, that blockades Gaza with 1.8 million people locked in its prison and is then surprised by the periodic eruptions of the inmates, and that responds disproportionately to attack in a way that left several hundred children dead. Jews, above all people, ladies and gentlemen, know what oppression is, what it is to be strangers in a strange land, what the killing of a child represents. Children over millennia with a transmission belt of Jewish survival, the object of what Amos Oz and his daughter Fania Oz Sulzberger have called the intergenerational quizzing that ensures the passing of the torch. The corrosive Israeli exercise in the control of another people, breeding the contempt of the powerful for the impressed, is a betrayal of the Zionism in which I still believe. As a result, if French or other European Jews did indeed heed Netanyahu's call and emigrate, they would find a Jewish homeland remarkable in its vibrancy, but based still on an uneasy foundation, that of dominion over the West Bank Palestinians, with no separation of religion and state, containing a restive Arab minority that accounts for 20% of the population, and marked by the increasingly racist diatribes of the nationalist and territorially maximalist right. When Netanyahu declares that the killings in Paris demonstrate how Europe and Israel stand together in the fight for Western values against violent Islamist extremism, he glosses over these uncomfortable Israeli truths. The fact is, the European Union today incarnates better the values of Israel's founding charter than Israel itself. Of course, Europe's living in a different neighborhood. I'm not underestimating the difficulties of Israel in living up to those values, or the fact that when Israel accepted the resolution of 1947, it was promptly attacked by several Arab armies with the intent of chasing all the Jews in the Holy Land into the sea. No Palestinian failing, and I've gone over some of them here, can hide the fact that, in my view, Prime Minister Netanyahu has never had a serious belief in a two-state peace. Well, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is spilling into Europe. Resolution of it would not solve the problem, but it would help. This is a vital European and American interest. The Muslim communities of Europe, often marginalized, are going through many of the difficulties of adaptation and integration that Jews faced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe. The Islamist killers of Paris began as petty criminals on the margins of society. ISIS thrives on giving a sense of mission to meaningless lives. Jews have been exhorted over the millennia to invite the stranger in. The lesson in Europe must be one of outreach. There has been a failure. There has been a failure with respect to these Muslim communities, most of whom are peaceful, want to get on with their lives, and want their children to succeed. At the same time, Europe must be honest, much more honest than it has been, about its anti-Semitic ghosts, and drop, please, the shallow tropes of fashionable anti-Zionism. The Jew killers are still around, even if they've morphed in form. The 4 Jewish corpses from Paris were sent to Israel to be buried. It's a very good thing that was possible. Herzl's Zionist answer to the Jewish question was the right one. Zionism is a proud badge. Its implementation still needs work, a lot of work. Another people's statelessness can only haunt an ethical people, the Jews, who were stateless for so long. Making peace will be arduous, but it can still be done. And to prove that, I will end here with a small miracle. It concerns my uncle, Bert Cohen, who was an immense figure in my life, and who died last year at the age of 95. He was a very distinguished professor of dentistry who spent his life looking for a cure to dental caries, was appointed commander of the British Empire by the Queen, grew up in South Africa, enlisted in the South African Army in 1943, was flown to Cairo, spent some time in the desert there drinking foul whiskey, he told me, and then shipped out across the Mediterranean, landing in Taranto in early 1944. And he then fought the entire Italian campaign with the Allies, doing dental work in freezing surgeries in the Apennines and seeing a significant amount of combat. And when he was in Florence in 1944, he was reconnoitering just outside Florence when, to his astonishment, a small bird landed on his shoulder. And the bird stayed on his shoulder for 6 days. And Italians thought he was a saint. They couldn't believe it. They saw this South African Jewish captain, wandering around Florence with a bird on his shoulder, and they would come up to him and say, Capitano, lei un santo, you're a saint. Can you bless our children? Well, Bert didn't have much idea how to do that. He vaguely remembered the old mnemonic, spectacles, testicles, wallet, cigar. But but it didn't always serve him exactly well, and he sometimes got it slightly wrong. And on the fourth day of this remarkable experience, an American officer came up to him and said, in the streets of Florence by the Arno, and said, "Say, Captain, you've got a bird on your shoulder." And he said, "Yeah, I know. It's been there for 4 days." He said, "Well, Captain, do you mind I take a picture?" He said, "No, sure." So he took a photograph, and it's in the book, if you for some strange reason might find this hard to believe. And so there is my uncle, Captain Bert Cohen, on the banks of the Arno. And so the photograph was taken, and I'll just read this passage from my uncle's diary, which helped me a lot in the writing of my book. And he writes, "Not 5 minutes after the photograph had been taken, my bird took off and flew across the river that, as the photograph shows, is at least as wide as the Thames at Westminster. I watched it as it flew southward without so much as a backward glance, and in less than a minute it was out of sight. I stood, dumbfounded, and waited for several minutes before resuming a lonely walk along the right bank of the Arno. I felt bereft. Some 15 minutes later, as I approached the Lucchese, I was looking out over the river when I saw a bird flying in my direction. Unbelievably, it alighted on my left shoulder. 'Where on earth have you been?' I asked angrily, but without being able to suppress my elation. To this day, the question remains unanswered." Well, also unanswered is the quest for peace in the Middle East. But I say work hard, work very hard, sweep away the slogans, deal with the realities, and don't forget those miracles. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Now we'd like to open it up to questions. Standard council protocol applies. Please raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question is a question. And we have a school group here from Francis Parker. We'll be calling on you shortly. Yes, the gentleman right there, please, in the beige shirt. Wait for the mic, please, sir. It's right behind you.
Netanyahu, I think, in reading a biography of him very recently by a man named Rosenthal, who worked with him, I'm concerned as much about Iran getting the bomb and Netanyahu's response to it, because I don't think Netanyahu is going to let him use it. And that has me very concerned. The peace of Israel is certainly involved in that. Have you any feeling on that?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been threatening to bomb Iran for a long time now, and it hasn't happened, and I think he's been wise, very wise, not to do that. Israel is in a conflict with the Arabs. I don't think Israel needs to be in a major conflict with the Persians, with the Iranians as well. And as you know, negotiations between the United States and its allies have reached a very advanced stage over an agreement that would strictly limit and render highly monitored an Iranian nuclear program where the degree of enrichment would only be compatible with civilian use of nuclear energy. And those talks are a delicate phase. Secretary of State Kerry has recently met again with Foreign Minister Zarif. I think that the successful conclusion of those negotiations would be the best thing for Israel, the best thing for the United States, for its allies, and for the Middle East. Iran is a power and a society with a lot of problems, a lot of issues, at times extremely repressive. It's also a vibrant society with a highly educated youth, a population that is generally pro-Western, pro-American. And it's been 36 years now since the seizure of the hostages in Iran. And I think in this very troubled Middle East, where Iran, let's face it, has been an island of relative stability, if this agreement could be reached, if it's foolproof, you can't take away the nuclear know-how that Iran now has there. You can't unmake it. You can't lobotomize these scientists. It's there. So so when Prime Minister Netanyahu says he wants complete dismantlement, that is fanciful. It's not going to happen. This is a source of Iranian pride. What can happen and must happen is that any possible route to a bomb in Iran must be cut off. And that is what I believe President Obama and Secretary Kerry are trying to ensure through these negotiations. And personally, I hope that the breakthrough with Cuba is followed by a breakthrough with Iran. It's more difficult even than Cuba, but it's not impossible.
Next question. Yeah, right here, please, in the second row, Mr. Sprayregan.
You're much better in person than sometimes in your columns.
Well, thank you very much.
And I thank you. In the interest of intense pragmatism, I'd like you to comment on a couple of things, and these are our questions, Niam. Between 95 and 98, at the time of the Oslo negotiations, I had the unusual experience of sitting in on 3 long meetings with Yasser Arafat. And one thing I believe I learned from those meetings is that even the powerful Arafat could not compromise the refugee issue, the return issue, without assassination from the refugees in Lebanon. I could tell you why, but I don't want to go into all of that now. It is always said by people like you who want to be intensely pragmatic and resolve the whole situation, as believe me I do, that somehow the refugee situation will be resolved. But I don't see that resolution coming. I don't think the descendants of the refugees have been told that they've lived in squalor in Gaza and elsewhere for years, and that a small Palestinian state will emerge without them going back. I recently discussed this.
Sorry, Mr. Sprayregan, we've got loads of questions.
Okay.
Could you get to your question, please?
I will.
Thanks.
I recently learned from a Palestinian intellectual whom I asked, for a state, would you give up the right of return? And the answer was, you didn't give it up for 2,000 years. Why should we give it up after just 66 years? I'd like you to comment on how that right of return, which they claim, and which the weaker Abbas cannot compromise, in my opinion, can be resolved in the intensely pragmatic solution that you correctly urge.
Well, it is, as you correctly point out, sir, an immensely difficult issue, and my understanding is that Abbas, at the crunch, when President Obama presented his outline, the American ideas for how to go forward with a two-state peace, and he's 80 years old, does he want to be the man who finally tells the Palestinians, not everyone is going home? Everybody knows this. There is no outcome in the real world in which that is going to happen. As I said in my speech, there can be every kind of form of compensation, recognition, maybe some kind of formal statement from Israel about what happened, but that is not going to happen. Of course, many refugees, if a state of Palestine is born, will be able, if they so wish, to return to that state. So I don't think it's any more intractable than Jerusalem, any more intractable than some of the security issues. I mean, these are immensely difficult issues. They are painful issues. But look, I just reviewed Lawrence Wright's book on Camp David for the New York Review of Books. And if there was one thing Menachem Begin was never going to do, never, ever, ever, it was give up the settlements in Sinai. He'd announced that he was going to retire there, and he was never going to give them up. And they spent 13 days, these 3 leaders, haranguing each other in the hills of Maryland. And they packed their bags, they were going to walk out. And there was President Carter with his yellow legal pad, and he kept coming at them again and again and again and again. And lo and behold, what did Menachem Begin do? He did what he vowed never to do. He gave up the settlements in Sinai. And similarly, President Sadat was fiercely pragmatic. He came to Camp David with a clear idea of what he wanted. He wanted Israel out of Sinai. He wanted an end to the wars that had taken more than 100,000 Egyptian lives over the previous years. And he wanted to align Egypt with the United States and come out of the Soviet orbit. He was intensely pragmatic about that. And the Palestinians would argue that he sold them down the river because he was so pragmatic. I would argue that the Palestinian leadership he was assassinated for his pains, but I would argue that the Palestinian leadership should learn from that pragmatism, start somewhere, start with something. It begins with territory. It began, for Sadat, it was Sinai. But once you have a state, all sorts of things, unimaginable things, can begin to happen. Let's imagine, for example, that 100 years from now, the border between a Palestinian state and an Israeli state is as meaningless as the border between France and Germany. I know, you'll laugh, it'll never happen, it's ridiculous, but who knows?
Thanks. Next question, Rachel Bronson, Senior Fellow on Energy at the Council.
Roger, hi, good to see
Hey,
you. Thanks for coming, I'm well. I wonder if I can shift you back to Europe. In the op-ed pages of the New York Times, several months back, there was a fabulous piece by a Muslim thinker who was saying that anti-Semitism is rising and an anti-Islam sentiment is rising as well. And that in your talk, you said how the Arab-Israeli conflict was pushing back into Europe, and he was saying that that's a bit of a shill. In fact, what you're seeing is just rising intolerance in Europe, and that's the problem we should tackle face on. And thinking of it as just anti-Semitism or an anti-Islam actually kind of divides and conquers rather than takes it on full force. Can you talk about whether you see a rising anti-tolerance and pluralism in Europe, and if that is a return to a past that's in some ways even more scary than these targeted views on particular groups?
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I think there's definitely a tide of anger rising in Europe. I do think that with regard to what's happening between the Muslim and Jewish communities, that one can't underestimate the impact of something like the war in Gaza. I really do believe that there is a spillover from that. But there are a lot of other things going on too in Europe. Whether it's the Moroccan communities in the Netherlands or the Turks in Germany or the Pakistanis in Britain or the Algerians in France, there's been a failure. There has clearly been a failure. As I said in the talk, these people who committed these heinous crimes in Paris, began with petty crimes on the margins of society and then found a mission, a purpose in life through this violent ideology, drawing its inspiration from a warped interpretation of Islam. And that is an issue that all kinds of foundations and organizations and well-meaning people like Tony Blair have tried to begin to address through forums and discussions. But the fact is the economy in Europe, at least outside Britain and Germany, is weak. There's not much opportunity. There's anger at the European Union, which I love the European Union, but that's not a very widespread sentiment these days. People fail to recognize its immense achievements, and there's a kind of diffuse anger at forces out there, the European Union, anti-Americanism too, and that is creating this climate in which both the Jews and Muslim communities are feeling more and more uneasy. The Muslim community is marginalized in a way that Jewish communities were 100 years ago and in Europe. And I think there are problems on both sides. I mean, certainly when I lived in Germany and also reporting trips to Denmark, it was very striking how hermetic the Turkish communities were, that they would go back to their village in Turkey when it was a question of finding a bride. And there is change, there is movement, and there are many Muslim families in Europe that are successful, very successful, but there's a malaise, and not just in France. There's always a malaise in France, but it's it's more widespread than that.
Next question. The gentleman right there in the teal sweater, please.
Thank you very much. With the immense amount of military aid coming from the U.S. to Israel, my question is, are we really the best ones to be trying to facilitate peace talks at all? And in addition, if we are facilitating peace talks, do we also need to be willing to make concessions in those negotiations from our side?
Well, I'm well disposed to somebody in a teal sweater because my daughter's favorite adjective is teal for some reason. Everything is teal this, teal that. I think there's a basic reality, which is that the only interlocutor that Israel really trusts is the United States. It does not, for all the calls to European and Israeli unity that we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu during his visit to Paris, the fact is that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership trust the United States pretty much as a mediator, does not really trust Europe. You have to mediate for a purpose. That's why I said I don't see any purpose in trying to resume the talks in the current situation. Something has to shift. I think the most eminent candidate for shifting is the political situation in Israel, but it could be something else. And I think Secretary of State Kerry, given the political reality of the United States, where still, Palestinian suffering, the Palestinian cause tends to be rather invisible. I think given the political realities that they made a good faith attempt to be honest brokers in the round, almost 9-month long round of talks that we saw. I think Europe should be involved, but I think the United States will have to play a leading role, and I think there have to be, as I said, negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, and preferably with a united Palestinian movement. I do not see, maybe somebody can explain it to me, I do not see how, whether it's the 2012 status that Palestine gained at the United Nations, I mean, that's 3 years ago, what's changed? Or the motion currently before the Security Council, or all these moves, how does that change the situation on the ground for most Palestinians? How does it help in Gaza? Where, by the way, these initiatives of Abbas are roundly dismissed by everybody, even laughed at. And that's 1.8 million Palestinians right there. So, again, I think there have to be direct negotiations one day or another. I didn't quite understand when you said, what concessions should we be prepared to make? What did you mean?
Sorry, can we get the mic back to the gentleman in the teal sweater?
Thank you. Specifically what I meant was in terms of military aid. I know that a lot of Israel is the #1 recipient of military aid from the United States. And though much of that is used for, in between different nations in the Middle East, a good amount of that military aid goes towards things that the Palestinians and Palestinian government don't appreciate. And so to what extent does the U.S. have power to change the reality on the ground based on what military aid we're providing?
Well, the short answer is the United States is, under any president that I can conceive of, is not going to use that kind of leverage with Israel. So it's a moot point, and it's a non-issue.
Great. Next question. Right here in the third row, please, Alan Rich.
I am not wearing a teal sweater, but I will be in Saigon in 2 weeks, and I'm happy to look up your son.
Please do.
I'm perplexed. You began your talk today talking about the upcoming election in Israel, and you said work towards the correct side winning, which is, let's say, the block around Herzog and Livni. let's imagine that we have a Knesset that's that bloc wins, and 2/3 of the Knesset is made up of people that support them. Let's make that assumption. Let's assume also that they say we will cease settlement construction for the indefinite future while we try to reach out, to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. Where I'm perplexed is, with whom? Who is the bargaining partner on the other side? Who do they speak with? And I've spent a lot of time on the West Bank, not in Gaza, and I'm still searching for that answer.
Well, the situations are fluid. They move, they change, they evolve in unpredictable ways. We know what the reality is under the current Israeli leadership, and we know what the response from the Palestinian side has been, and we can criticize both, and I have. We don't know what the situation would be if there is a change of Israeli leadership, and we don't know how a series of gestures, a new dynamic, could begin to induce changes on the other side. Now, I don't see another interlocutor but Mahmoud Abbas for the moment. I believe there should be an election very soon, as soon as possible, in all the Palestinian territories. So we know where Palestinians stand. We don't know that right now. We really don't know. So I don't, if I believe that Israel had really sought in recent years, in good faith, to reach a two-state peace, so that was, when Prime Minister Netanyahu sort of gets into bed at night, was saying, gosh, damn it, I really was hoping we would make progress, and was not saying, oh, I think I've won us another 6 months to stall. And, if I thought it was the former rather than the latter, then maybe I could buy essentially your argument, which you hear in all kinds of ways from all kinds of people. There's no partner. What can we do? Well, first try. First be serious about trying. Then you can throw up your hands. But I don't think one can throw up one's hands without an earnest, good faith attempt. And I think the change in leadership that you mentioned and I've mentioned would make that more likely.
We have a student group here. Everyone looks like a student, actually, but I know we actually have a student group from Francis. Any questions from the students from Francis Parker? None? Oh, there's a woman in the back there. We'll take her instead then, over there in the corner, please.
Come on, students, arise. Where are you?
Hello. I wanted to ask you, I know you said there's, and one state is kind of off the table, but would you consider that today's situation is actually a one state already, where the occupied Palestinian citizens just have less rights? And given this situation today, would you consider a miracle solution of Israel giving the Palestinians, the occupied Palestinians, equal rights to those of Israeli citizens, including the right of return?
It's not one state because Israel has not annexed the West Bank. It's one entity in which more than 2 million Palestinians are disenfranchised and routinely humiliated, and this is a desperate challenge to Israeli democratic values. You have people living in the West Bank who vote. Those are the settlers. You have people many more people living in the West Bank who don't vote, and those are Palestinians. And you have roads that Israelis can drive on, and you have roads that Palestinians can't drive on, and all this is a terrible and corrosive situation, and every attempt should be made to change it. I told you, I don't think one state can work. I mean, you just suggested creating one state. If you gave Palestinians the rights you just described and said to all Palestinian refugees, 4 million of them or however many, that they can return, you would have many more Arabs than Jews in this one state. And that's the end of Israel as the Jewish homeland and a Jewish state, and I, as a Zionist, don't think that's a good idea. Others may disagree.
Great. Next question. How about the woman in the back right there, please? Thank you.
Whenever I go to Israel and talk about a two-state solution, what I hear is we got out of Gaza and look what we got. We got missiles. So what do you expect the Israelis to do in terms of a two-state solution?
Thank you, madam. I'm very familiar with that line myself. Yeah. It's probably been said to me 1,000 times. And there's sort of some truth in it and quite a lot of untruth in it. Again, it comes down to what you want to achieve. If you talk to World Bank or International Monetary Fund officials who tried after 2005 to create something viable in Gaza, and you can't create something viable if the borders are closed, if it's encircled, if it's sealed off. There is no better environment in the world to breed violent extremism than Gaza today. You have a seething place closed off to the world, full of refugees, with no opportunity and a non-functioning government, a non-functioning economy. This is a factory for violent extremism. Is that what Israel wants? I don't think so. So I don't think, again, we get back to the issue of good faith. Were you withdrawing from Gaza to say, you see, we withdrew and look what we got? Or were you withdrawing from Gaza with a serious aim in mind of creating an entity in Gaza that was open, that was viable, in which people had a future, in which there could be successful lives? Now, of course, we all know that there was an election in 2006. It was a free and fair election, by all accounts. We know what the outcome was. Hamas won. And we know, the whole succession of events. But I find that argument basically pretty unpersuasive, because I don't believe that Israel ever had in mind that Gaza should be a success story. And if you have a success story, look at Europe, not Europe today, but the arc of European development over the last 70 years. If you have openness and prosperity, that is the way to resolve ancient historical disputes. And I don't think anything was proved by Gaza. I don't think you can say, QED, we withdraw from the West Bank and we're going to have rockets on Ben Gurion. I think that's a facile argument. I don't buy it.
Okay, right over here, please, the gentleman in the navy blazer. Thank you.
If the Europeans are so intolerant, how do you explain the fact that more than 20,000 young Israelis have moved to Berlin? And I understand they're very happy there.
Well, it's a mixed picture. Berlin's a great city, and it's. I mean, I lived there myself. God, every time I go there from London, I wonder at the prices in Berlin. It's less than half the price of London, and it's very, it's a vibrant and open city. I mean, maybe the more interesting thing in what you said is that young Israelis are leaving. And why are they leaving? I think they're leaving because of the unease that I described, and that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for Israel. Look, Europe has been through a horrendous week. Last summer was pretty horrendous too. There are very worrying political developments. As I said at the beginning, if there was another major incident, I don't think we're far off. Something much worse could happen. But the borders are still open. Europe is still a place where you can go and be successful. I think I live in the most open society in Europe, Britain. I'm moving back to New York in June, but even the openness of Britain doesn't come anywhere near the openness of the United States. And that's, in essence, why I became an American. Also because being a Jew in Britain is very different from being a Jew in the United States, where Jewishness is lived exuberantly rather than in a whisper.
Next question, please. Yeah, the gentleman right there in the middle, please. Yep.
So during your talk, you alluded to a segment of Israelis who have a maximalist view of what should be Israel's territory, and you've also mentioned the settler movement. I'm wondering, I mean, assuming the next government is more serious about peace, what do you see the obstacles being from the people who have these maximalist visions and people who want to continue settlement expansion? I mean, do you think it's possible for the government to manage that part of Israeli society?
Thank you, sir. Well, every Israeli shares a fundamental concern, and that concern can be summed up in one word: security. So anything that any government does and manages to agree with the Palestinian side has to satisfy that basic Israeli requirement, which is that we're not going to be fooled again. We're not going to do this and then find suddenly that we're talking about the borders of 1948 rather than 1967. In other words, the end of Israel again. So I think any leader of Israel, there are political realities for an Israeli leader just as there are for a US leader, and we may deplore them, but they're there. So such a leader would have to convince Israelis in their majority that whatever was proposed or being done was ironclad in terms of ensuring the security of Israel. Now, I think that can be done. I don't think that US generals spent more than a year looking at those requirements and how they can be satisfied, or indeed Israeli generals who I'm sure examine exactly the same issues. I don't believe that they cannot come up with a solution. Jordan, just across the other side from the Jordan Valley, has diplomatic relations, after all, with Israel. And if any of you saw The Gatekeepers, the movie, did many of you see it?
Yeah.
Well, as you know, in The Gatekeepers, the interviews weren't with any old Israeli. They were with leaders of Shin Bet. They were with the very men, they were all men, who had devoted their entire lives to the security of Israel. This was the be-all and end-all, the raison d'etre of their existences. And what was their conclusion? We can't go on doing this. We can't police every single Palestinian home. We can't listen to every single Palestinian conversation. This occupation must end. It's corrosive. It's damaging to Israel. It's damaging internally. It's damaging externally in some of the ways we've been seeing. So if those gentlemen, for whom security was perhaps even more primordial than for the average Israeli, reached that conclusion, isn't that something that the Israeli leadership, American leadership, European leadership should work toward? And shouldn't there, on the other side, be a Palestinian leadership that was prepared to look beyond the next turning in the road, down the line with their children in mind, and say, okay, this is a bad outcome. We're sacrificing things that mean an enormous amount to us. It's really bad. But as Churchill said of democracy, it may be bad, but it's better than any alternative. Let's get to statehood. Let's begin somewhere. Let's start building. Let's build. Let's not make grand speeches, go to the UN, go wherever, declare the justice. Competitive victimhood gets you nowhere. I mean, Palestinians and Israelis can argue for the rest of time about whose narrative is more persuasive, more vivid, more true. It doesn't matter anymore whose narrative of 1948 prevails. That's the past. It's gone. What matters is the future. And for that, as I've said more than once, we need to be ferociously pragmatic.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 7:16. That's unfortunately all we have time for. Roger Cohen will be signing the book over there, but please join me in thanking him for his remarks tonight.
We're being asked to do a photo.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Over here.
Thank you very much. Oh, really? Okay.